Let me see that for a second.
No,
this
no,
is
no.
On the video.
I know what you're gonna do with my Android. You're gonna wreck it.
Phone shaming.
Well, you know.
If you have an Android, you should unsubscribe to this channel. Just joking. Just joking.
Just keep drinking your Kool-Aid.
All right, so guys, I'm not going to be in this video. I'm going to stand behind it because I'm not a subject matter expert on broadheads, but Josh is. I shoot fixed on elk, and I preach that just for, you know, margin of error, kind of basically give yourself the best chance to recover that hard-earned shot opportunity. I've had real good luck with Grim Reaper, and Josh will talk about them, but he's going to talk about all broadheads and just kind of the basic mechanical principles on expandables as well as fixed and flight and maybe some physics too. So this is Josh Jones, Spokane Valley Archery. If you're not already, find him on Instagram. He posts like once every 6 months. It's
That'll
pretty
get
cool.
better, Hawk. That was harsh. Well, guys, basic breakdown of broadhead stuff. There's really 3 different types of broadheads. I mean, there's offshoots of each type, but you basically have your lead cut style broadhead where the blade goes all the way to the end and back. There's also a lead cut style. You have your fixed blade, replaceable blade style, 3-blade, and then you have a mechanical style. Main differences being this is more what I would call a traditional broadhead. This is like something similar to what you've probably seen for an eternity of 100 years back. Stuff like this came along a little later. This is more of a, what I would call a bone-breaking style of broadhead. The design here is to be able to take an impact and not have the lead of the broadhead bend or break. Whereas something like this, because it's so fine on the tip, it's very easy to bend it and break it. You lose penetration. That guy right there, and there's tons of them that look like that. That's not a brand specific, that's just a type. This is your chisel point style broadhead like that. Lots of them out there. We're not specifying brand by any means at this point. It's just a matter of what's the difference really. And then that's your, most of you have probably seen that because it's pretty common and pretty popular. So differences are very, very simple. This is probably going to penetrate the best. This is probably going to take the biggest impact and still keep going. This is probably going to fly the best because the blades aren't deployed until it hits the target. It does not mean you don't need to test this and make sure it shoots the same. It just won't shoot off as far on an untuned setup per se. Pluses to each. This, just about any poundage, any kind of arrow weight, you're going to penetrate farther. You're going to get into an animal farther on this. You most likely get a pass through. In an ideal scenario, you want to shoot out the back side. That's 2 holes in an animal instead of 1. It's going to bleed better. You're going to be able to have a better blood trail to follow because of those purposes. And you're most likely to recover the animal in that scenario, in my personal opinion, but once again, personal opinion. This, if you hit a rib, if you hit a shoulder, if you hit something hard, this is more likely to penetrate and stay together. If you take something like this and hit a rib, your arrow is going to be going at an angle like this. It's going to hit the rib and change direction. You're going to lose all your energy. It's not going to go in very far. This will hit a rib and break the rib and keep going in that direction. So at least when you've placed your arrow in the right path to go through the rib cage where you typically would try to, it's more likely to keep going that direction. Your mechanical is going to put a big old hole in something because it cuts at a larger cutting diameter. In this particular type, any that look like this are going to run a similar design. This is going to actually stretch the tissue a bit before it starts to cut it. So we'll end up putting a cut in something that's more like about that wide in comparison. So recovery on a good shot is usually higher. A questionable shot is lower. So if everything's perfect and you've placed your arrow where you're supposed to and everything worked right, this is going to be a shorter track, most likely. However, if you make a bad shot, this is less likely to recover. So there's pluses and minuses with all of them, in my personal opinion. Now, this is becoming more and more popular these days. This is a lead cut, 1-piece style broadhead that's also somewhat chisely. So this is, because it's 3 blades and because of the way it's constructed, when it hits something hard, it may compress on itself a little bit, but it's still going to keep going straight. And it's still likely to keep going through. So this is more, in my opinion, like a hybrid of a standard 3-blade style chisel. This will still take an impact. And once again, not necessarily this brand, but things that look like this are very similar. This is 1-piece machined CNC steel. Now, you also come into, when you get into chisel points, you get into multiple blades, 2 blades, 3 blades, 4 blades. This is an example of 2 almost exactly the same broadheads, but one's 3 blade and one's 4 blade. Now, this is going to put another slice into something, but this is going to penetrate about 20% deeper into whatever you shoot at because there's less resistance on the cut. So myself personally, I'm not a big fan of 4 blade because it does tend to not penetrate as far. Everything else being equal. Just because one has 4 blades and one has 3 blades does not mean it's going to penetrate better. I mean identical style broadheads with an extra blade in them. Now, on penetration, typically, the longer a broadhead is versus wide, the better it's going to penetrate. In Ashby's tests, he did 2.5 to 3 times as long as it is wide. Penetrated better than anything. All it really boils down to is this angle has less resistance when it's cutting through stuff than this angle does. I mean, if you look at it from a logic standpoint, it's kind of obvious to see it. The biggest problem in stuff like this is it's hard to find things that weigh what this weighs that look like this. You're not going to find it. It's going to be really heavy. So in turn, when you start adding a lot of weight, you now need a stiffer arrow or a shorter arrow to be able to still stabilize that broadhead. If you take this, if you're sighted in with 100 grain, you take something like this and put it on there, it's not going to hit anywhere near where it's supposed to, and it's not going to group very well. You have to maintain the same level of weight in the front from what you were tuned with. So the only way you're going to solve that is by using a stiffer arrow, a drastically stiffer arrow, to achieve the same thing. Now everything's a lot slower and then it's dropping more, then the animal has more time to move from when you shoot it. So there's a give and a take with every single thing you're going to try to do, regardless of what it is. But for the safest bet, all around versatility and usage, something like that, once again, I'm not specifying brand, although I do really like these. I think they're really well made head. They're kind of unique in the regard that their chisel is really sharp. So it still penetrates really well, even though it's a chisel. A lot of this part, or the chisel, is not super sharp for most manufacturers. They'll make this more blunted because they're figuring it's just for breaking stuff when it hits something. If you can find chisels that are really sharp right through here, you're going to have a lot less resistance when you try to go through the hide. The hide of an animal is typically actually the hardest thing for your broadhead to cut through. It's what slows it down the most. Once you get cutting and once you get through that hide, it doesn't take nearly as much force to keep going. So this part on penetration is really important. And as an adult male hunting an animal like an elk, the penetration is pretty important. Deer, not so much. So something like that that cuts a bigger hole in it on like a whitetail isn't probably as big of a deal as it would be on elk. You get into a bigger animal with hide that's a lot thicker, it takes a lot more to cut, it becomes more critical. But in a best all-in-all option, overall durability, something that looks real similar to that is probably a really good safe bet. So when it comes to broadheads, don't skimp. You can skimp on any other part, and it's not going to affect it nearly as much as the broadhead itself. This guy determines how well your arrow flies from A to B more than any other part of your arrow. Don't be cheap here. Spend money here. It's relatively important. Those are my tips and explanations of different types of broadheads. Feel free to comment and ask questions.
Yay. All right. Try to not go down a rabbit hole here. So we'll go.
Is that all right?
Awesome. So Josh is, we'll do more videos. You guys comment what you want to know, but I know people are going to ask this. So I'm going to kind of set the stage. We got a bow. It's timed. It shoots bullet holes through paper. We got the right grains per inch for the arrow. We got the right stiffness. We don't have too many fletches back there, not much weight on the back end. You're like, Josh approves of this arrow. Fill points are hitting great. Now it's time to slap on broadheads, and I get a little variance.
Well, when you say a little variance, are you talking the size of the group or where the group impacts in relation to the field points?
Yeah, the latter.
Okay, so when the group impacts in a different spot, it usually has to do with a couple of different things. And a lot of that will depend on whether or not it's high or low or left or right. But if we're assuming the groups are the same size, but one's hitting, let's say for a right-handed person, that the broadhead group is hitting to the right, can be several different things. One could be a weak arrow. The arrow itself is just not stiff enough to stabilize what you're trying to do. And when an arrow is too weak on a right-handed person, it generally tends to, actually that's stiff, sorry. No, wait, that's weak. Right.
Weak right.
Weak right, stiff left. So if it hits left, you could be too stiff. Your cam lean or wheel alignment could be off a little bit. You could be torquing the bow a little bit that can create that variance. Some broadheads just hit right at their field points. One particular that we kept running into all the time was shuttle T's, which I don't have one of those sitting down here. It's a great broadhead all in all, but for some reason it always hit to the right and we could never figure out why. But your general rules are it's either wheel lean, arrow spine, or hand torque for left or rights. Up and downs is a different thing altogether. Low impact points can also be a weak arrow. That is not uncommon. That if your arrow is just not stiff enough, it may hit a little lower when you shoot broadheads out of it. Most of the time it's a knock height or cam timing orientation issue. But in general, that's typically the only things that I'll run into. Normally a human being can't force their arrow to hit lower by how they're holding the bow. It's normally just left to right. It's very hard to force your bow with like an immense amount of heel pressure or throat pressure to change the up and down. That normally does not happen. It would typically be spine or timing or knock height or knock travel. So if you have a 15-year-old bow and it was, for lack of a better phrase, designed poorly in the cam system, that when you draw it back, it doesn't maintain a straight path. Sometimes you'll get arrows that just go low and there's just nothing you can do about it. It doesn't matter how hard you try. It's just going to do that.
What's the best distance? So let's say it's time to put on broadheads. Look like me. Spring bear's coming around the corner. Let's say I get froggy and I'm like, all right, this is the week. I'm putting broadheads on. Been shooting great with field points. Is there a magic distance to kind of expose variance but still kind of maintain if I'm a decent shot?
Well, if you've already paper tuned and you know your bow's paper tuned, preface that, because if you haven't done that and you just stick a broadhead on 10 yards, you might miss the whole target. It just depends on if it's wrong. So, but assuming that we've done that and we've done our best to tune the bow as much as possible before then, I start at 20 yards and I shoot a broadhead and then a field point. Shoot the broadhead first, because if everything's perfect and they're going to hit in the same spot and you shoot your field point and you follow it up with your broadhead, you're going to cut your arrow, whether it be the fletch, the nock, or the arrow itself if you hit in the same spot. Field points don't do nearly as much damage to an arrow as a broadhead will. So always shoot your broadhead first, then follow it up with your field point. And then identify what's going on there. Always, always, always. If you have a variance, start trying to figure out what the variance is, ensuring that it's not in the arrow itself. So if you get a difference, grab another arrow and another broadhead and shoot that one too. And make sure they go on the same spot. If you have identified that, then it's time to start weighting out what it could be with the things that we have mentioned. This is probably the hardest thing to achieve in tuning a bow, is getting the two to hit perfect. So don't be discouraged if you're trying to do it by yourself and you can't figure it out. There's a ton of shops that can't figure it out either. So don't feel bad if you run into this issue and that you just can't seem to solve it. There are instances where it just doesn't work. But in general, if you follow the things that we suggested as far as what causes those to be different and what to try, you can usually rule it out. It'll usually be one of those things. Oh, and rest position can cause it too, but if your wheeling is caused to be off and your rest position is off to compensate that through paper, you may end up having to adjust wheeling and arrow rest to get those recorrected. So if you do a wheeling adjustment, you may have to dink with the rest too first. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, so let's say we go to, this will be my last question, because let's say we go to 20, we shoot our broadhead, we shoot our field point, we're satisfied. We push out to 50, we shoot broadhead, field point, and we shoot it a couple times to make sure we're seeing the same pattern. Is 50 kind of a good place to, once you're dialed at 50, you're kind of good to go? Or
I would assume if you got 20 yards and 50 yards into the same, the need to shoot farther than that should be moot. That's assuming that they are exactly the same.
Right.
Really, really close. If they're really, really close, the farther out you get, the more obvious it is. So if you shoot 70 or 80 yards, it'll move by more. So it's how far you feel you can comfortably even pull off a shot. If you can comfortably pull off a shot that distance, go ahead. But if you've got field point and broadhead impact to where you can't shoot the two at the same spot without them hitting each other at 50, I would think you're probably good enough as far as practicing and knowing that my broadheads are good.
Let's say you were, I thought another one, Randy Ulmer, and you're out to 100 yards, and you have all your arrows and all your broadheads, and you're shooting them all, checking for this kind of pie plate group, making sure, and you get a couple flyers, as people will say, and he'll walk over and he'll quarter turn the nock.
No, he's not doing that. He's actually just throwing those arrows away because he doesn't pay for them.
Okay.
So if you have 4 dozen arrows and you're trying to get 12 perfect ones, that's the easiest thing. You build 48 as best as you
No,
can.
seriously.
And shoot them all at a target, and the best 12 are the ones you use.
Okay. But when you
But
do
that's, you know, infinite
indexing,
budget.
do you do that? Do you buy into that?
Well, to me, when you run into that, my bigger concern is that you probably have a little bit of a lower quality arrow when you run into that.
Okay.
Can you make that arrow work? Sure. Would that arrow be served better as a practice field point arrow at that point? Probably. So what Dan's referring to is every arrow's got a stiff and a weak spot in it. And if your nocks aren't orientated just right on that particular thing, when you go to shoot that arrow, it won't impact in the same spot just because it's bending differently out of the bow. So if you have a stiff spot up here and a weak spot up here and you fire it, it's going to bend downward. Well, if one of them's faced like this, it's going to bend left to right, and that's going to show up when you put a broadhead on it because it's going to impact in a different spot because of it. If it's all like one arrow out of 12 or whatnot, I'd probably just make it a practice arrow to alleviate it. But if you're not in that scenario and you have to make it work, turn it to the next fletch. So 120-degree rotation will realign your 3 fletches in the same position, but turn, see if it impacts different. If it impacts where the other ones are at that point, you're safe to use it. But to me, if I run into that, it usually means it's got a weak spot in it that's greater than the other ones, and I'd just rather not use it personally in that scenario. But if you got to make it work, that's the solution.
Okay, guys, thanks for watching. Post your questions in the comments below. We will do another roundtable with Josh and tap into he's been doing, have you built over 10,000 bows?
I don't keep a tally, but probably.
And he's been doing it since he was 7. His dad owned an archer shop. What? Yeah.
Yeah.
You're old now. That's a lot of time.
40, almost 41.
Post your questions. We'll try to get to them in about a month from now, but we'll start piling them up as the season approaches and dive more into the stuff. And you local guys, hey, if you're going to shop anywhere, come here, Spokane Valley Archery. All right. God, that's good information.